Welcome to the second part of our six-part series on human rights and environmental due diligence in public procurement. The series is brought to you by Electronics Watch, Industry All, Fair Trade Advocacy Office, and Rethinking Value Chains, with the financial support of the Charles Leopold Meyer Foundation for the Progress of Humankind. My name is Peter Pawlicki. I'm Director of Outreach and Education at Electronics Watch. Let me do, as usual, a bit of housekeeping first. The presenters will be speaking in English, but there is an interpretation to both French and Spanish. When you look at your bottom part of your Zoom window, you see a symbol of a globe, and you can select there the language you would want to listen to. If you have technical issues, you can search for Martina Hooper in the chat, and you can send her a direct message. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Electronics Watch website after the event. It will be public. The last session, so the first one of this series, is already public if you want to have a look. Human rights and environmental due diligence can be an important instrument to protect workers, communities, and environments in global supply chains. But we all know that this is a very contested terrain. We see this currently on the level of the European Union and its sustainable corporate governance policy process. As this process is developing, we want to ask in this series, what is effective due diligence? For us, it is important to bring in voices of stakeholders of due diligence that are often left out of the debate. Meaningful stakeholder engagement is vital, not just in doing due diligence, but also in defining it. Our partners, the Industry All Global Union, brings worker trade union perspectives to the table, and the Fair Trade Advocacy Office opens the perspective to issues of smallholders and smallholder farmers. This series focuses on due diligence and public procurement as we as Electronics Watch work in the field of public procurement. We are an independent monitoring organization for more than 300 public buyers in Europe and Australia, and we help them to work together to protect the rights of workers in their electronic supply chains. So today's session focuses on measuring effective due diligence, on the questions of monitoring, of verification, and reporting. We will talk with experts from the fields of procurement, monitoring, unionism, and activism about the role of monitoring and reporting for the impact and change that we think is necessary. This will be a panel discussion. But first, we will hear a brief presentation from Christel Tonstad on the new Transparency Act in Norway, which is really interesting. Christel was the head of the Secretariat of the Ethics Information Committee in Norway, which drafted the Norwegian Transparency Act. And now Christel works as policy director at the Norwegian National Contact Point for the OECD guidelines. So Christel, thank you that you are here and want to tell us more about the great new law in Norway. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you very much for this invitation. I'll just see if I can get up my presentation here, and then we will get into the crux of the matter. Can you see it and hear me well? Brilliant. Yes, so I've been invited to give an introduction to the Norwegian Transparency Act, focusing on the due diligence requirement contained in the Act, and also on the reporting requirements and monitoring compliance with this law. But before I delve into that, I thought I would just give a brief recap of the OECD national contact points. The national contact points of the OECD are really charged with promoting the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And there are, as of now, 38 member countries, and then 12 additional countries that are adhering to the OECD guidelines and therefore have to have national contact points. So we promote the OECD guidelines and handle specific instances where there is an allegation that a company has not followed the guidelines, and then cooperate with national contact points in other countries and with the OECD secretariats. And really at the heart of, or the backdrop for many of the laws that we're seeing passed, especially the law in Norway, when it comes to transparency and supply chain due diligence, is the UN guiding principles for business and human rights that were passed or adopted by the Human Rights Council in 2011, which really sets forth the expectation that companies should respect human rights and exercise due diligence to know and show that they are indeed respecting human rights. And then the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises that date back all the way to 1976, but were crucially updated in 2011 with a chapter on human rights and also an expectation on due diligence with respect to the company's own operations, but also with respect to due diligence across business relationships. So these are sort of the foundational frameworks. And then, of course, we see these laws that are being adopted in various countries, building to varying degrees on these frameworks or on these international guidelines. So there are a number of countries that have adopted laws relating to transparency and supply chains. And I think this trend has really sped up during the past 5-6 years, with most recently the German supply chain due diligence law that was passed last year, and the Norwegian Transparency Act that was passed in June last year. So I'll just give just a brief sort of background and overview of the process leading up to the Norwegian Transparency Act. It was, as Peter said, it was drafted, proposed by the Ethics Information Committee that was appointed by the Norwegian government in 2018. And this was a multi-stakeholder committee that was asked to look into whether it was necessary and expedient to require Norwegian companies to provide information to consumers and organizations on corporate social responsibility and supply chain management. So it was sort of a broad mandate. It wasn't specific on due diligence. But indeed, when the committee proposed this act, it included a proposal for human rights and decent work due diligence for larger enterprises. And this is really what became the core of the Transparency Act. There was a public hearing in 2020, and then the proposal from the government that was put forward in April last year, and then the law was passed in June as proposed by the government. It will enter force on the 1st of July this year. And really at the heart of the law is the due diligence duty with respect to human rights and decent working conditions and to information duties. And that's what I'll just run through. But first also just about a few words about the purpose of the act. The purpose of it is really to promote enterprises' respect for human rights and decent working conditions in connection with the production of goods and provision of services. And then secondly, the goal is to ensure access to information on how enterprises address adverse impacts on human rights and decent work. So these are the sort of two pieces that are reflected in the provisions of the law. It will apply to larger enterprises. Larger enterprises that offer goods and services in or outside Norway, also to larger foreign enterprises that offer goods or services in Norway and are liable to taxation in Norway. And the threshold for the law, I think compared to other legislation that is coming in this field is quite comparatively quite low. You'll see the conditions here for, or sort of the definition of what constitutes a larger enterprises according to the Transparency Act. And at the core of the law is the duty to carry out due diligence. It says explicitly in the law that enterprises should carry out due diligence in line with the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And really what this means in practice is due diligence in accordance with the guidance on due diligence that the OECD developed in 2018. It's a more detailed guidance for how to conduct or how to exercise due diligence. And you'll see that the definition of due diligence in the law really aligns very closely with the guidance from the OECD. So it starts with embedding responsible business conduct in policies, then really the due diligence of identifying and assessing actual and potential adverse impacts, not only caused or contributed by the enterprise itself, but also that impacts that are directly linked with the supply chain or business partners. And then it's about implementing suitable measures to seize, prevent, or mitigate adverse impacts. Then, crucially to this conversation that we're having today, track the implementation and results of measures. So that is a requirement according to this law. And then communicate with affected stakeholders and rights holders regarding how adverse impacts are addressed. So again, very relevant to the conversation today, specifically stakeholders as trade unions, workers, and their representatives. And then it calls for providing for cooperating in remediation where this is required. And that is where the enterprise itself has caused or contributed to adverse impact on human rights or decent work. This is just to show that it follows quite closely, indeed, the steps of the OECD due diligence guidance. And the law also says very clearly that this is to be a regular and ongoing process, ongoing way of doing due diligence. It is to be proportional in relation to the size of the company, where it's operating, the context, and it's also to be risk-based, which means being based on the severity and the probability of adverse impacts. Just when it comes to tracking, the preparatory works of the law make it very clear that tracking is to contribute to making, to improving the due diligence in the future, or to improving the company's mitigation of any adverse impacts in the future. So it's ongoing, based on tracking, and it should be geared towards continual improvement. The due diligence duty mentions specifically, as I said, stakeholder engagement. And stakeholders, of course, are defined as quite broadly. Of course, workers and workers' representatives, trade unions, also representatives from local communities, civil society organizations, investors, and professional industry and trade associations. And it's also clear that rights holders also includes the representatives of the rights holders. Just a word again on stakeholder engagement. The law is explicit on communicating with stakeholders about how adverse impacts on human rights and decent working conditions are addressed. But stakeholder engagement is relevant at many stages in due diligence in accordance with OECD principles. It's not just when it comes to communication. It has to do with the policies that you set in place, the actual risk assessments, how they're followed up. It's relevant, and of course, when it comes to remediation. So it's relevant on many stages, and the law is explicit on stakeholder engagement, on communicating how adverse impacts are addressed. Then I'll just go briefly through the information duties in the law, reporting requirements, you could say. First of all, there's a duty to account for due diligence, and this is really the public reporting requirement in this act. So the account should include a sort of a general description, as you see here, a general description about policies, area of operations, guidelines, and procedures. Then it calls for providing information regarding actual adverse impacts and significant risks of adverse impacts on human rights and decent working conditions. And then information on measures the enterprise has implemented or plans, as well as results or expected results of these measures, where the tracking dimension again comes in. So this is supposed to be an annual account, and it should be easily available on the company website. It should also be updated in the case of significant changes to the company's risk assessments. It also says in the preparatory works for the law that when it comes to this reporting, the general description should also include information not only about policies and routines, but also on early warning channels and remediation mechanisms. So that should be part of the general description or the general account that is provided publicly. Then this is a provision that is perhaps somewhat unique when it comes to due diligence laws. It's this right to information in the Transparency Act. And this really empowers organizations, consumers, trade unions, and others to direct questions or written requests to the company directly regarding how the enterprise addresses actual and potential adverse impacts. So here you can sort of access some more specific information that perhaps is not provided in the general public account on due diligence. This provision does have a parallel in the Norwegian law in the Environmental Information Act, but I think is kind of unique when it comes to comparable legislation on supply chain due diligence in other countries. It's the Norwegian Consumer Authority, which is charged with providing guidance about the acts and also monitoring compliance. And there is the potential for enforcement or infringement penalties for breaches of the information duties, and also enforcement penalties for breaches of orders relating to the due diligence duty. But there's a focus on guidance, that guidance will be the sort of main method of working as this law enters into force in July. Since this law hasn't yet entered into force, there's not too much we can say about how is it being, I mean, we can't really say that there's a big significant interest in the law. And of course, questions regarding what is this really all about? Are we going to, there's some worries about it. When it comes to monitoring compliance with the law, I think I just saw that Shift has created a resource on signals of seriousness, also when it comes to monitoring and evaluation. Some ways of looking at whether or not due diligence laws are being followed up in a meaningful way. So that's just a pointer to an interesting resource that's out there on monitoring and evaluation. But just to summarize quickly, of course, we are seeing a move beyond CSR and mandatory reporting on modern slavery and other human rights risks in supply chains. And the Norwegian Transparency Act is an example of that move. It's quite broad in terms of the scope of application. And of course, it only covers human rights and decent working conditions, not environment. So if something is passed in the EU that also relates to environmental due diligence, that would probably also have to be included in the Norwegian law or somehow ensured in other legislation. And then I just leave it open for a question. If perhaps this is what one could call a stakeholder-centric law, I think stakeholder engagement is important in many ways in this law, not least when it comes to the right to information. And so it will be interesting to see how this is used in the future by companies and by stakeholders. That's all I had for now, and I'm looking very much forward to an interesting discussion.
Thank you, Christel. That's really that's even more than what I have read already about it. So I think this will be really interesting to see the application of this law, because I don't have a legal background, but from what I understand it is actually the strongest regulation we have seen yet. And there will be, I hope, some initial push from civil society as well as public procurement in Norway to make use of this law and to really get into the into the learning process for the industry, that they have to set up structures and they have to become more transparent and they have to actually do what they talk that they do. So what I would like to do now is I would like to start the panel discussion. And what I will do is I will ask every participant in our panel some questions, and they will discuss this a bit about when. I want to start with Michael, with you, also because we are kind of always having this procurement perspective, and it is kind of also important to understand that reporting and monitoring is not only for civil societies important, civil society organizations, but also for other stakeholders. So welcome, Michael. Michael McLaughlin, you are the head of category and information services at APUC. APUC is the procurement consortium of Scottish universities and colleges. And APUC is also an affiliate with Electronic Swatch. So the question would be, APUC, from what I see, is, in my perspective, one of the leading public buyers in Europe when it comes to sustainability and sustainable procurement. So could you tell us why, for you and for APUC, and probably for any other public buyers, why verification and monitoring is key?
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Peter, and it's great to be taking part in this discussion. Yeah, for APUC, we place a high importance on responsible procurement in general. We take social and environmental aspects of the supply chain really seriously, and we feel that we've got a duty to know about our supply chain, so understand transparency, what's happening, where are areas of risk potentially within the supply chain. Which is why verification and monitoring might be key. When we're appointing our suppliers, just like Crystal laid out in her presentation, some of the characteristics around due diligence, our procurement process embeds responsible procurement criteria to help compare and score contract delivery, but also sustainability measures. So we'll be awarding contracts based on environmental, ecological, ethical, human rights. We're obliged to score and award framework agreements and contracts based on the responses to our tenders. But our specification will also it'll allow us to develop and verify, further examine some of the working practice throughout the contract period, with a view to developing our supplier in terms of continuous improvement. And of course, monitoring will help us do this to help us try and achieve due diligence by providing an insight to what is actually happening in the factories further down the supply chain.
Okay, thank you. So it's for you, it's a central tool to really get to know what is actually happening on the ground, and whether the standards that you have put into your tender are actually complied.
Yeah, exactly. We use Electronic Swatch to help us monitor the supply chains. It's a worker-driven methodology, which we like. It's a slightly different approach, and it allows us greater geographical coverage than we could undertake with internal audits. And what we do is we take Electronic Swatch reports and we work with our supply chain to try and overcome any potential violations in the supply chain for human rights. And we find that some suppliers have worked with us on this, and particularly OEM. I would suggest it's been quite effective because suppliers tend to conduct their own audit, and they'll respond, and it might encourage a dialogue with Electronic Swatch. They maybe share their own due diligence programs with us as well, so their own annual auditing programs. We feel that's what we find that quite useful. It's often done under a non-disclosure agreement. But also what we're developing to help our due diligence, we've designed our own system, which will help question the supply base on their responsible practices.
And we will come back to your system in a moment. But now, so now we kind of have the perspective what is happening on the one end of the supply chain. What are actually the procurers that are buying these things? What do they need? But it's obviously Monitoring is actually about workers, about communities, about smallhold farmers, because that's where it actually has to impact. We need to see improvement. So this is why we are very happy to have Kalpona Akhtar on the call. Welcome, Kalpona. You are a worker rights activist in the textile and garment sector in Bangladesh, and you're a founder and executive director of the Bangladesh Center for Worker Solidarity. So your perspective is kind of on the opposite end of the supply chain. And the textile and garment sector has seen decades of campaigning. I mean, there is, since the 90s, at least I remember since the 90s, it probably went back further back. There were multi-stakeholder initiatives campaigning, countless projects. So when you look back and when you look at the current situation, why do you think monitoring is still so important and central from your perspective?
Thank you, Peter, and hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. You know, I was in factory, okay? So I have seen that how this traditional social auditing look like. Like when I was child labor, I would be, you know, put in hide in the toilet when the auditors would be coming at the factory. So the truth has been never come up. So do even it is happening today when we talk about the MSIs. So why it is important for us to having a monitoring, a real monitoring, because otherwise you would not know how the workers have been treating in this factory, in the end of the supply chain. So we just don't need this. I mean, we just don't want this social auditing. We need a real monitoring, which is like, you know, which just has a transparency. The people have access to see exactly what happened in the factory and what improvement need to be done and what improvement has happened. And we need a worker's voice on it. Otherwise, you know, the monitoring really doesn't make any sense to us, or auditing doesn't make any sense to us. So in order to make improvement in down to the supply chain, monitoring is needed, but that should be kind of like, you know, enforceable, not like a corporate social auditing that we have been seeing in decades.
So it's not only about understanding what is happening, but also following up on what is happening.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. That was really on point. And let's stay at this end of the supply chain. We have invited Dimitri Kessler, whom I currently don't see. I don't know if he turned off his video. Oh, yes, there he is. Hello, Dimitri. You are a founder and director of the Economic Rights Institute that are specializing in worker rights issues in China. And that is also one of our monitoring partners, central to the work we do. So the Economic Rights Institutes and all of you as researchers, as auditors, and as monitors, you have a long experience in this field. Why do you think do we need monitoring and verification? We already heard from the textile and garment sector. Is it similar in electronics, or do we see different issues?
Well, I think there is maybe a very simple and universal sort of truth underlying the need for monitoring, which is essentially that there is a conflict of interest, that undermining workers' rights can reduce costs. It offers some level of convenience under some conditions. It shifts risk. That's not only true for the employers of the workers involved. It's true also for the customers who are buying the products made by those employers, and that's true of more dispersed consumers. It's also true of public procurement, that there are conflicts of interest, and for that reason, self-disclosure is just of limited effectiveness to pierce the veil, to understand really what the situation is with workers' rights. Even within industry, they deal with this in terms of to what extent they can rely on suppliers' self-appraisals on their conditions, even in very discrete settings. Also within, there is some attention to this because the norm within the code of conduct community is to conduct quote unquote independent monitoring, usually through sort of third party kind of consulting service providers. But there the independence is also reduced by the fact that there's a selection of of different parties. So we can also have a conversation about the different methods, and there's lots of critiques about sort of methods on site. My tendency is to say that the more fundamental issue is that there is this lack of independence in monitoring, and there is a conflict of interest that is going to push things into the direction where workers' rights infringements remain hidden.
Thank you, Dimitri. Now let's go to Hester Janssens. We are jumping now really between sectors. So we've been in textile and garments, we've been a bit now in electronics, now we go to food and the food chain. So welcome, Hester. You are a policy and advocacy officer at Fairtrade in the Netherlands and an expert on global food chains. And as I learned in our prep call, you also work on public procurement. So that's actually super interesting. And what role and importance is monitoring actually have in HRDD systems of the food supply chain?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Peter, for having me today, and it's very interesting to join this conversation. So, just as in the other supply chains that we're now talking about, in the food supply chain, monitoring is really important as well, due to the fact that many of the food that is being produced by millions of smallholder farmers and workers in, for example, banana plantations, comes with serious human rights infringements and environmental risks. So performing due diligence is of course getting traction in the food supply chains as well. Unfortunately, not all businesses are doing it, so that's why we really need the legislation broadly accepted to ensure that all businesses need to implement due diligence. And without monitoring, of course, due diligence, well, is not complete. It's a crucial step of the due diligence cycle. And I think for Fairtrade, of course, being a certifier, but also way more than that, monitoring is a broad concept that consists of various instruments. So in the food supply chain, especially where the human rights infringements are often at the beginning of the supply chain, at farmer level, community level, plantation level, you need to have dialogue and capacity building and trainings and really know the people that produce the food and ensure that there's a safe environment in sometimes really difficult situations or contexts where the political context doesn't allow for trade unions to be formed, for example. So you really need to break through that. And social auditing is one of the instruments that you can use in that, but it's not a holy grail or a silver bullet in detecting everything that is wrong. So if combined, I think we can have the best results in that, but still we need everyone in the supply chain to join. We need businesses to co-own that responsibility as well and invest so that rights holders are included in every step of the way. So it's really important, and I think it's developing really soon as well, and new techniques are coming up as well, but we cannot be naive, I think, or underestimate the challenges that are still there to include everyone in the dialogue. Yeah.
Thank you. And now we go to Glenn Bufane, who I think represents the strongest technology to actually have monitoring, because it was developed around 150 years ago. It's called trade unions. And it actually, that's the bottom-up technology that allows us to understand what is happening in factories and also have a remediation on site and locally. So welcome, Glenn. You're the director of mining and diamond gem ornament jewelry processing at Industry All Global Union, which is the global union federation in the manufacturing sector. And so what I would like to ask you is, what is the Industry All perspective on human rights due diligence initiatives? And what is your work as a union federation on a global level to support these projects?
Yeah. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction, and thanks, Electronics Watch, for the invitation. Industrial, in terms of its approach to HRDD, takes a global supply chain and life cycle approach to HRDD. And this approach is forced on us by the very fact that we organize workers across the whole mining, energy, and manufacturing industries Due diligence, by definition, requires a shift from only a sectoral approach and focus, and Industrial Global Union is well positioned for this strategic shift. At our Congress in Brazil in 2016, we made the determination that there is an unsustainable and deeply abusive business model that prevailed across our industrial sectors that fostered what we call global supply chain impunity. We made the determination that the global economy suffered from an accountability gap, that corporate social responsibility and instruments were failing to detect and prevent violations and abuses of workers' rights. We moved from that premise. When we made that determination, then we were well on our way to developing a truly multi-stakeholder initiative, an antithesis, if you like, to the failed corporate social responsibility ethos. And that initiative was EMMA, which we'll talk about in depth later, which published its mining standards in 2018. Taking that further, we are involved also in a mining performance benchmark, which is the Responsible Mining Index of the Responsible Mining Foundation. And internally, within Industry All, we're in the process of developing our own battery supply chain strategy as the low carbon energy transition continues to put pressure on downstream users of battery minerals, such as the auto sector and the ICT sector, to demonstrate responsible sourcing practices. So that is, if you like, the philosophical approach of Industrial Global Union.
Thank you, Glenn. So I think now we have a bit established, I hope, why monitoring is important. And also there were already signs on what it does actually mean to do good monitoring. So I would like to move there. And Dimitri, I would like to ask you about your and your colleagues at ERI perspective on good monitoring. I remember during our prep call, we talked a bit about the origins of monitoring, and you kind of said, well, it's one of the origin sources is naming and shaming campaigns that were really important to bring the issues up, but it has also some impact on how monitoring is thought about and how it is used. So could you expand a bit on this, please?
Yes, and I would even say that the kind of naming and shaming, this kind of public exposés of problem conditions are not limited to the beginning of this, where they brought attention. There is actually a kind of an intersecting of the influences, the risk and the fallout from high-profile exposés definitely drives a lot of interest and sometimes commitment to maybe more modest methods, but that probably would be harder to mobilize if there wasn't this sort of outside risk of a public expose. So in that sense, I think it's pretty core to the dynamic that we see in all monitoring. At the same time, a deeper problem of those exposés is that, and there are some exceptions to this, there's a couple of Chinese groups actually that have really tried to go beyond the more common model of exposés, but most exposés, they seek out factories or brands or just a kind of an adversary who is more well known to the public. And that can be useful, that can be motivating, but it also skews your perception of the issues. They tend to really, the level on which they're gathering information focuses attention on the misconduct of factories, of suppliers, which often makes it more difficult to think about deeper lines of responsibility. There's also a tendency to, in a kind of one-off fashion, point the finger at that misconduct, and there's less connection to continuous monitoring. There's less visibility about improvements. Even not every improvement that's tried will succeed, but that kind of information is not often part of exposés, and there's a lack of awareness about sort of business norms and business pressures that are affecting how factories can move. So in terms of good monitoring, I think we need to think about systems, not just looking at sort of one factory looked at, another factory looked at, but to think about systems of monitoring that fundamentally, no matter what your methodology is, need to confront limited resources, that you need to be monitoring widely, but without the ability to send people to every factory that exists. Even if the government were doing labor monitoring, that's not how they would do it. We need sort of deeper discussion of responsibilities that extend beyond suppliers. We need to think about where there is actually room for improvement and the drivers of that improvement. How do you actually implement these improvements? We need that kind of discussion and depth without just pointing to kind of moral aspirations that aren't met. And we need to think about business norms, the scope of possible improvements, and complexity in how factories are and how they change, and the unintended consequences that will likely occur, even when we're trying to do good.
Thank you. And Kalpana, what I wanted to ask you, and this is me having no idea about the textile and garments industry, but when I was thinking, I thought like the Accord, I mean, it build up such a system, or at least it tried to build up such a system where you have more systemic and systematic approach to monitoring. Has actually during the Accord monitoring changed in Bangladesh? And if so, how did it change?
Thank you. Yes, it definitely did change in the ground. It's a phenomenal document. It's a legally binding agreement, first time with the union and corporation, okay? And it has been included the local union, so we have voice on it. And how it has been changed, you know, I need to go in a lot of detail, but I just wanted to say that workers' voice has been included. The union voice has been included in the Accord. So during the audit, the workers can say that how they feel when they've been working, you know, in the factory. It is safe, it is unsafe, and what need to be repaired and renovated in their eyes. I mean, what they feel. So before, you know, prior to the Accord, the workers would be considered any other equipment in the factory, but this is not the same now. And top of that, it is transparent, so anyone can see that you know, what was the findings of that audit that has been done by the inspectors, and what is the corrective action plans are, and the workers get to see all this report, not like, you know, in the website. Also, the inspectors goes and share with the worker, and periodically they do monitor whether that corrective action plan has been taken care or not. And there is a consequences. You know, as it is an EBA, enforceable brand agreement, and it is legally binding, if brands are not complying with all those clauses we have in the Accord, they can be taken to the arbitration, which is huge. None of the brand wanted to, you know, lose their image or face, and they're really afraid of, you know, this arbitration. So, I mean, so these elements really make it stronger. However, these Accord do not cover whole industry. That is one of the big challenges that we have been facing in here. You know, in a government, we have like 4 million workers are working. Only 2.2 million are, you know, covered by the Accord. Still, we have like 1.8 million workers who are working kind of unsafe workplace, because they still under the social auditing system, which is not transparent. And, you know, for years we have seen that it has always been failures to save our workers' lives.
Thank you. So there is actually room for improvement. And every time I hear about what is happening in textile and garment, I actually think, well, electronics is well behind, and we would actually need some more inspiration from textile and garment. Michael, I would now like to go to you, and again, kind of, okay, we have talked now about good monitoring from the perspective of monitoring and of activists, but let's go again to public procurement. So what I know is that at APUC, you have developed at APUC a own monitoring system that was called, or is called, Sustain. Could you give us a brief overview of why you did this, and also what were the tools and capabilities you have developed to do this monitoring?
Okay, yeah, so we started a project called Sustain, and I actually had two goals. One was to create a supplier code of conduct that we could agree with our sector, and then try and encourage our suppliers to sign up to. And then we wanted to create and develop a software system to carry out due diligence against that supplier code of conduct. And the idea was to create a specific question set. Initially, it was maybe too large, but to take the suppliers through and score in areas in relation to our sustainability and workers' rights. And we would do this during the contract process, during the contract management process. So after the contract had been awarded, and we would be part of reporting and continuous improvement of the supply chain. Since the beginning of the project, we've actually rebranded the tool Supply Chain Contract Management, so SCM, and we've split it into two sections. We have SCM section 1, which is high level, and it allows us to verify statements such as modern slavery statements, some ethical and environmental policies and statements, and reaction towards climate change. But section 2, which provides a much, it's a deep dive into the supply chain. It's a large, more complex and challenging question set to the suppliers, covers many areas: remuneration, working hours, health and safety, dispute resolution, for example, as well as the environmental side. And the idea is that suppliers provide us evidence against each question in the question set, and we can score and benchmark suppliers, and then work with them on their system would create an improvement plan that we can work with the suppliers and develop them throughout the contract term. We've got responsible procurement staff at APUC who are trained to evaluate these responses, and we also did some of that within the team, the procurement team. We worked with some of our institutions, University of Edinburgh, and with a partner consortium, LUPC, to try and increase the number of suppliers in that system. So we managed to get about 40 to 50 suppliers completing that process.
Okay. Thank you. I know that you have shifted the system a bit. Could you tell us why and what has changed?
Okay, so we still have the SCM section 1 and section 2 tools and question set, but we've actually recently started a trial with, well, it's not a trial actually, we've got a 3-year contract with a company called EcoVadis, who's already quite prominent within, certainly within the electronics industry, but within other industries. And it does a similar, it takes similar actions in that it evaluates supply chains for a number of areas, similar areas to our section 2, but it already has 85,000 companies using it. So that we can get all the suppliers who are already using that tool to share their scorecards with us, and we can cover a much greater capacity early on. We'll have disadvantage in that we'll lose some of the data ourselves, because that will be kept by EcoVadis, but we'll be looking still to have benchmarking and improvement reports. And the beauty of that question set is that for furniture manufacturers, the question set will be different from electronics, so it will be specific to what we're actually buying. And we're buying lab equipment, estates and buildings, IT, and professional services as well. So it will cover all these areas. Actually, what we're finding just now, it is very resource intensive to undertake the due diligence within section 1 and section 2. And we've got supply chain issues elsewhere just now. There's some supply chain disruption. And we also have demand for our responsible procurement resource within the sector to tackle climate change. And EcoVadis, and using EcoVadis, might free up that resource to concentrate in other areas. So there's some good reason at the moment to move to EcoVadis. Okay.
So public buyers are actually having to invest quite strongly into also monitoring. So that's really, that always fascinates me. Hester, going back to smallhold farmers, smallholders, where do you see the difference in impact between, say, civil society-led monitoring and social audits for them? Is there any difference? And if so, how do they perceive this?
So, yeah, that's actually, in that sense, a difficult question. So I'm not an expert on civil society monitoring. So for me, it's quite difficult to assess, it all depends on both instruments, civil society-led monitoring and social auditing, on the quality, of course, and is it part of an holistic view of instruments that you apply to address human rights risks? Because we all know that social auditing, but also civil society-led monitoring in that sense alone are not enough to address human rights problems. So it needs to be part, and that's what smallholder farmers need, to have like a holistic view on the problems that they have on a daily basis. So for example, receiving low prices can lead to more child labor, etc. And all those things need to be assessed and addressed, and only then you can start working with social audits. So it depends on the quality of the standards that you have, the quality of the auditing systems themselves, and more importantly, what do you do when there's, for example, a non-compliance? So for fair trade, it's really important to have, and that's a really delicate balance, to have like a really strict approach, because public buyers and of course companies need to know that certain requirements are being met in that supply chain. So for example, is there a fair price being paid? Is there a zero tolerance policy on human rights violations, etc.? But also to know that we do not leave them alone once there is a violation of, for example, a certain human rights. So for example, child labor, you cannot leave the smallholder farmers alone, because it's not their fault that there is child labor. It's often the supply chains dynamics that lead to child labor. So I think those things together are really important. And then the more ownership and say farmers will have in that process. So for example, when monitoring and remediating child labor in coffee or cocoa supply chains, the more successful it will be on the longer term, of course, because it should be way more than just an auditor coming and going and writing a report. That's not what it's about. It's about a holistic view of instruments. And I think for fair trade, it's really important to also work with other NGOs and experts on a local level, local governments. So you need to combine everything. And for public buyers, it's important to know that either way, civil society-led monitoring or social auditing are no guarantees for zero violations, but that they are instruments in that process, and they really need their suppliers to implement that whole process of due diligence, and they can use monitoring, civil society-led monitoring or social auditing in that process, but it's not a substitute for it. I think that makes it difficult. And again, the more say farmers and workers have in this process, the better, but we'll come to that later on.
Yeah. Thank you, but I think it's an important point to say it is not only about knowing what is happening, but also knowing about the responsibility one has towards the supply chain, and also that decisions on top of the supply chain do have impact, and it's not just keeping a clean slate and being without risk, because that is very often just pushing the risk down the supply chain.
Yeah. We cannot ask more of farmers without enabling them to improve their situations, and they need to be able to do it themselves. It's not up to us. So yeah, that's really important. What are the root causes of the violations, and how are businesses contributing to that, and what responsibility do they have? So yeah.
That's really important point. So let's move once again to mining, Glenn. I know you've been, and you already mentioned it, you've been part in the development of the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, or short IRMA. And it is probably, or not probably, it is the highest level we can find in mining when it comes to standards and auditing. Could you tell us a bit more what makes the standard and the methodology unique?
Thanks once again. IRMA is unique for a number of reasons. The important, and some of the panelists have already spoken to this. The important of which is its governance structure that is rooted in its truly unique multi-stakeholder character. Power, which is very important part of the conversation, is about power. Power is dispersed equally across its constituencies. EMA is the only organization that hosts a mining standard and certification system that is led by a multi-sector board using an equitable governance model. That is, each sector has the same voting rights and decision-making is by consensus, right? In terms of methodology, it covers best practice requirements on 26 topics, making it a very comprehensive and rigorous mining standards. And it was developed through a robust multi-stakeholder process over 2 global public consultations, 1,500 plus comments, 2 field tests, many expert working groups over a period of 10 years. Importantly, the methodology is underpinned by a third-party independent assurance by auditors external to the mining companies. And it is EMA that appoints the auditors and evaluate whether a mine is meeting the EMA requirements. So it is very, very comprehensive. And on top of that, the results of the audits are released publicly with details about the mining operations, visited facilities, interviews that the auditors conducted with company representatives from across different departments, workers, and communities. This makes monitoring by affected and consulted stakeholders possible. The audit provides for access to remedy in case of any matter material to the audit, giving rise to dissatisfaction or grievance with the audit. So that is basically what makes EMA or differentiates EMA from other standards out there.
Thank you. And every time, or the one time I read the auditory report that it was released by EMA, it was really a transparent and very detailed account of what is happening, and it provided the mine with a certification level of the lowest level. So it was quite kind of clear there are many things that need to change. So I think that's also a pretty straightforward measure of how well is the methodology. Transparency was already mentioned many times. Christel, what I would like to ask you, going back to the Norwegian Transparency Act, I mean, we have been talking now about social auditing, monitoring. Where do you think will the Norwegian Transparency Act, what kind of system will it facilitate? I mean, I know we are talking now about the future, but from your perspective.
Well, it is a bit hard to predict, but I think the law itself doesn't cater to generic reporting, generic CSR reporting. It doesn't cater to superficial social audits because it requires specifically information on actual and potential adverse impacts and how these are being dealt with. So that's one thing. Secondly, I think it's important that there is monitoring by a public body. So it is to be monitored by the consumer authority. That's also important in terms of what kind of follow-up it caters to. And thirdly, I think it's this right to information implies that civil society monitoring will be important, but not only civil society monitoring. I think also monitoring by trade unions and the involvement of trade unions will ideally be very important. So it sets the stage for non-superficial meaningful due diligence and reporting, but it remains to be seen how this is indeed practiced. But I think the law itself tries to avoid some of those pitfalls, perhaps. Mm-hmm.
So it will be on us to really push the boundaries here.
Among other actors.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. It will be very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would like to now go back to what we've already heard from all participants, basically. it is about what role different stakeholders play in the process. That's kind of the central piece. It is obviously about systemic perspective. It is about a systematic approach. It is about remediation, but it is obviously also and centrally about who is getting a voice in this process, and also how are they getting the voice, because that's also an important thing. It is not being pictured in a nice civil society CSR report, and this is my voice that I have as a worker. It's about more. So Glenn, what we see since some time now is that industry stakeholders, as well as industry-led initiatives, talk increasingly about worker voice and tools to support it. What is the trade union's perspective on this?
Well, our perspective derives from the, as we had the UNGP and the OECD guidance, which are very eloquent on the role of trade unions and workers, that voice. And our view is that, very few, if any, industry live up to their expectations. Our view also is that unless workers, impacted communities are brought into the governance structure, as I mentioned, and the development of the standard, there is no workers' voice to talk about. If a standard cannot ensure that labor rights are upheld, in particular, the question of neutrality and the right of workers to collective bargaining and freedom of association, then workers' voice in that standard is meaningless. Unless workers can identify with the standard audit reports, and as you mentioned, the closely sustainable reports are meaningless, are not different from corporate social responsibility. Now, in as much as the market can drive improved performance through differentiation, trade unions, through direct engagement, can have a similar impact. So the voice must find expression in the impact that that voice makes. And it is to drive improvement in those areas, germane to or important or to workers. And that is basically driving improvement performance from the bottom up. In fact, the investor community is looking critically at to what extent workers' voices are integral to the sustainable and due diligence conversations. And one of the important tools, as I mentioned, is remedy, access to remedy mechanisms. Training awareness by companies in collaboration with unions. Practical assistance to workers voice being raised is involvement in the audit process without fear of recrimination. Now, the Responsible Mining Foundation says develop a mining assessment tool, which is a simple to use tool for workers in terms of assessing the impact that the operation has, on workers and communities. So there are different, if you like, avenues through which the workers' voice can be raised and be heard.
Thank you. Kalpona, you already mentioned, and I found this really a striking and stark picture, that through the Accord, workers were not anymore kind of things in the factory, but actually they were seen and heard. Could you maybe delve a bit deeper into what has changed through the Accord? What role of workers and their voices and their representatives has changed through the Accord?
Thank you. So one of the big change is that, we used to criticize always the traditional audit, that it is being always announced, so factory got enough time to, coach workers on what to say. The Accord audit also announced, but different way. It announced to the union first that here is the factory where we're going to, do the auditing and inspecting. So if you have a member, can you assign them to be with us when we are auditing in the factory? So this is like two different worlds, right? So workers themselves can, and also the union themselves, union representative themselves can be with the auditors in the factory without a fear and say that what they feel. And within the code, there's a safeguard for workers that if workers make any recognized or anonymous complaint to the code or give any information about safety inside the factory, the workers will be not face any consequences. Their job will be not in risk. If that happens, then we can bring the factory in the complaint mechanism. And there is a huge escalation process for the factory to face, because all the bodies that come together, the union, workers, brands, the companies, and a code, they all need to come together in one discussion table to resolve those complaints. So this is a huge safeguard for workers. So, to achieving this, I know that, sadly that we have to lose over 1,000 workers, but this is phenomenal that we were able to achieve it. But still, the country regulation is not there yet. So we still need to fight, the union workers together. We need to fight in here to establish that. And one more thing I just wanted to add, I saw in the question that, and also one other speaker also spoke about the child labor issue. Always, it is very clear who made the child labor. The low wages, the poor wages, of course, these companies and the factories. When you will pay a minimum wage to the workers, to their parents, the child labor never will be stopped. So the companies and factories now need to pay a living wage to workers if they really wanted to eliminate the child labor from the work. Hazardous or non-hazardous, doesn't matter, but child labor need to be stopped. So living wage is necessary. Over to you.
Thank you, Kalpana. That is a really important point. It's actually quite easy to get rid of child labor, just pay higher wages. Michael, as a procurer, workers in that situation are obviously pretty far away from you. I mean, Scotland has a very long history of industrialization, and you were quite early on with that, but still currently it's very far away. But still, what do you think is a benefit to see meaningful worker voice for a due diligence system from your perspective?
Yes, well, we've just heard quite Glenn and Kalpana talking and quite strongly about the importance of a worker voice. I mean, the freedom to unionize and express concerns, and collective bargaining to debate and highlight issues. It's got to be the most essential human right. And the question is a good one to me, because procurers, we don't have direct contact with trade unions. For example, we're very interested in the workers' voice, but we don't have that direct contact. But what we can do is we can ask suppliers questions, and we can make, within our terms and conditions of our contract, we can make sure that they allow unionization and freedom of association. We sometimes the suppliers can respond to us though by saying, we allow freedom of association in accordance with local law, so that can be a blocker for us. And we also, within our SCM section 2 that I talked about earlier on, we asked questions around trade unions and the ability for workers to express voices. I think the most important thing for us though is to try and continue to work with monitoring partners, because that's where I see that we'll get contact and we'll hear the workers' voices, and we can raise these kind of issues with our supply base. So we, as I say, we have done that in the past. Some of the issues around public procurement are that we have to, we're limited in what we can ask because it has to be related to the subject matter of the contract. So it can be really difficult to get to issues around mining and trying to bring those to the table with the contractors, because you can't necessarily be traced to the product. But we have to continue to work with the monitoring partners to at least raise the workers' voices with the contractors.
Thank you, Michael. And Hester, what needs to be done in farming or in food supply chains so that smallholder farmers are actually heard?
Yes, thank you. So that's of course really important because the supply chain dynamic, or the conventional supply chain dynamic, is so that there are very low prices being paid. Payments are being done in sometimes 300 or 360 days. There are serious cases of cut and run. In, for example, the coffee supply chains, whenever there's a case for child labor, then some big coffee companies just say, okay, well, we will never source again from this cooperative. And that's also a responsibility for public buyers to really understand that that's not what we want. We want public buyers to also assess their suppliers and really ask from them to show how they engage with their supply chain and how they implement fair trading practices, fair purchasing practices, to ensure that those root causes are addressed. So in all this, of course, I understand that, especially for a public buyer or for some businesses, it's more difficult to have direct dialogue with the people at the beginning of the supply chain. But there are many ways to include that. And for example, how Fairtrade does that is that, well, beginning already with the fact that producers own 50% of the vote in our General Assembly. The way that the standards are being set up is an inclusive stakeholder process where farmers and workers are consulted in, and they can tag in on what requirements in the standards will be. So I think it needs to be done on all levels, and for public buyers to know that when you work, for example, with a certification system, or when you ask for a certification system in your procurement policies, really also try to understand how inclusive those systems are themselves, because there are huge differences, of course. And for farmers, it's just really important to also have a strong say in their supply chain, and that for Fairtrade begins with forming strong cooperatives with democratic processes, and those things are, well, possible for public buyers to check upon as well. How are the payments being done? Are the farmers able to spend their premium the way they see fit, not what the company wants them to do, but they see fit to do? And how, so all those things need to come together, I think. And well, for Fairtrade, it's the basis of what we do. And of course, it's difficult in some regions, more difficult than in other regions, but it's, without this, it's just top-down instruments, and well, that will not work on the long term. And we need long-term commitment, so we need all to pitch in together. Yeah.
Thank you, Dimitri. Now the kind of the standard question always when it comes to trade unions, it's, oh, but China. So you and your colleagues at the Economic Rights Institute, you focus on China, and we all know the union situation in China is a very specific one. There are no independent unions, so to say. So what would be your perspective on worker voice within this very specific framework? And also, you have worked now a lot with Electronics Watch and our affiliates. How do you think public buyers can actually support any worker voice?
So obviously there's a lot to say on the issue. I think the first thing I would say is that probably most people on this call are aware that China is going through a kind of period of closing, or more sort of inward focus. I think I've lost count of the number of workers' rights groups that have been shut down in recent months. So it's a disturbing situation, and censorship and freedom of expression are even more fundamental to even beginning to have that conversation about freedom of association. So I would highlight that. People are certainly also aware that there have been recent sort of calls for boycotts about linked to serious violations of freedom of employment. I think this is also a very serious issue, and I think the recent efforts have undeniably shifted things in a positive direction, not in the sense of making yet a difference for workers on the ground, but the number of people aware of the issue, conscious of the issue, thinking about what to do, what next steps might be, it has been transformed by that call for a boycott. So I recognize that value. At the same time that, and I don't think this just reflects sort of my position living and working in China and ERI doing most of our work in China, I don't think boycotts are a solution. They may be part of driving a solution, but they don't actually mobilize the resources needed to do things differently. We have generally a kind of very pragmatic view about how to exist in this space, and we definitely exist in a very gray space. I think there's a lot of focus in discussions of China on sort of government restrictions of freedom of association, and there's no way to sort of underestimate the seriousness of those issues, but they are not the only issues. If you're concerned about freedom of association, there are so many other issues that are really important. We need pragmatism to move the needle. We're not so much supportive of those kind of moralizing from the outside claims. At the same time, I would like to say on the issue of pragmatism, we're aware of unions from Northern Europe that are training for-profit consulting companies in China who are now delivering what they advertise as union trainings to industry. We would consider that not a productive way forward. We would consider that fairly inconsistent with really basic tenets here. But in a more positive way, I mean, if public buyers are interested to support freedom of association, even in a more limited context, I would have several questions. First, can you effectively impact overtime to give workers enough time to think? If hours are incredibly long, freedom of association doesn't matter. You can have elected worker representatives. They don't have time to think about anything, or much less negotiate with management. The other side of that coin on a structural issue is flexible employment. Currently, China, despite the government's positive efforts to promote employment security, the industry has responded by intensifying flexible employment. And when workers expect that they're going to lose their job in 3 months, they just become less interested to mobilize in long, difficult struggles for benefits that they will probably never directly experience. So overtime, flexible employment, these are key structural issues that public procurers can have impact on. My last point, a simple question would be to public buyers: how do you connect with workers in terms of those sort of other issues that affect freedom of association, even in a context where maybe certain conduct is illicit or prohibited by the government? For freedom of association to matter, for unions to matter, for worker voice to matter, workers need to know one another. They need to experiment with how to express themselves. They need to find and identify collective common interests. They need to identify workers who have the will and the skills to pursue those aims. And there's a massaging that happens very naturally between workers and employers, even without sort of formal institutions, which is motivating. It creates the preconditions for deeper work. And this is one of the things that in ERI's methodologies, we prioritize getting workers and management in the room, talking to one another. Things change when that happens. Workers experiment in all sorts of really subtle ways, and calling for unions or pointing to the non-existence of unions is just not enough to help workers on the ground.
Thank you, and I think that that's a really important point. There is no black and white. There is no digital one-off. We have a union or we don't have a union. There is a long way until you actually have a meaningful union that can do something. And we can, especially as public buyers and as an organization that works with public buyers, we can break this down into small steps and push each step to really see change. So we have now talked a lot about monitoring. We have now talked a lot about what role of workers should be in monitoring. We have now around 10 minutes left. Let's briefly talk a bit about reporting, because at the end, monitoring leads to data, leads to reporting. I myself find reporting sometimes a system that is just there. So reports are because reports have to be there, and then we do the next report. So my question is, what is good reporting? And Kalpona, I would like to ask you, just imagine the situation, you read a corporate sustainability report. What would you like to see there that you think this is actually a good report? What would you like to see in such a report?
Workers and union voice. The workers has been interviewed. The union has got access to, union has been interviewed. Then I would be saying, yeah, it's a good report, because without a worker's voice, it cannot be a comprehensive report at all. So when you're asking the question to the workers, that should be either union office or outside of the factory, so they can tell you, without a fear what they feel. And of course, the relevant union need to be interviewed, or their voice need to be heard in that report. Then I will consider, yeah, it's a good report, and it has a little bit of transparency.
Okay, thank you. Michael, again, you as a public buyer, what is your experience with reports that companies share with you? Are you happy with them? Are you not happy with them? Do you like to read them?
Well, they've got two types of reports. They've got reports, the glossy brochures that they publish annually on sustainability, and yeah, there's lots of information there. There's also reports that we ask for at the time of tender, which might be around supply chain transparency specifically. And we tend to find, we want to understand where our suppliers are for geopolitical reasons, climate change, human rights, any transparency is really a major issue for it. But we tend to find that the reports don't have, they're not that comprehensive. They don't have as much detail on, deep into the supply chain, and even in relation to what components and products factories are producing for the brands. So we would like to see an improvement on that. And I'm quite interested in the Norwegian Transparency Act. I'm hoping legislation like that makes it easier to get information from the companies.
Thank you, Michael. And Hester, when I was thinking about what kind of questions should I ask you about this, I remembered these apps and smartphone apps that basically allow to scan you a code on a banana, and then it tells you a story that is transparent. Do you think this is a helpful form of reporting, helpful for the affected farmers and communities?
Well, we could argue whether it is a form of reporting. I don't know if having this information constitutes as reporting, but it's certainly something that you can use in reporting. But I think it's helpful in the sense that it creates consumer awareness, for example, which is really important, and it creates a connection between consumers and producers. So in that sense, it can be good. But the main responsibility lies with the businesses and organizations, and not so much at consumer level, is my opinion. So it's definitely something positive, and we could build upon it further. But the QR code itself doesn't say anything about the human rights conditions on the community level or on the farmer level. So that's also maybe for public buyers really important to understand that in reporting up until now and up until legislation will be implemented, it's way easier for businesses to report on all the positive things that they're doing, how many schools they are funding and all those things. They all sound fantastic, but what we really want to know is how do they prevent harm and negative consequences in their supply chains. And for a public buyer, that can be really difficult to read through, but start asking those questions even more and more, and look beyond all the beautiful things that are mentioned in the reporting, because we can build as many schools as we want, but as long as people are poor, the children won't go to school. So it's that we need to pick through all the nice stories, I think, which is difficult sometimes. And that's where experts come in. So, yeah.
Thank you. Glenn, so what I said in the beginning is that CSR, ESG, and HRDD systems are heavily focused on reporting. What is your perspective and industry all perspective on this? Does reporting help, or how could it help?
Thanks, Peter. It's a very good question. Because it should not be reporting for reporting's sake. For us, reporting should be about impact disclosures of the operation. impacts to workers, to the environment, society, etc., etc. It must be about transparency in terms of the full range of impacts, and not only impacts, but mitigation measures. So in a sense, it is about accountability and how, as workers, we can hold the company accountable using these reports. And if these reports don't help us do that, then they are not useful. We agree with the, the approach of the Responsible Mining Index, as I said, which we work with, in terms of how to access or assess whether reports are helpful or not. They do that in terms of 3 indicators. One is the commitment indicator, which assess the extent to which companies have produced formalized commitments endorsed by senior management and assigned responsibilities and resources to implement these policies. And this takes us to the action indicator, which assess the extent to which companies are systematically putting in place measures to improve and maximize the potential benefits and avoid, minimize, or mitigate the negative impacts. Indicator 3, which is the effective indicator, which assess the extent to which companies are tracking, reviewing, and acting to improve their performance on these issues. So broadly speaking, and to the extent that, workers are your most important resource, transparency, insofar as the results of the audit are widely shared, workers have got access to these audit reports, access to the performance gaps that are clearly identified and what corrective measures mapped up or tracked, can then make reporting very useful. So for us, it is a critique or a critical approach to reporting. Therefore, reporting in the absence of engagement, consultation, and dialogue with workers is a disservice to transparency and approximate the absence of a social license to operate. These prerequisites are critically important in building trust and credibility of the reporting entity. So transparency therefore goes to the heart of reporting, and developing transparency is a process that workers must be engaged with. It is not a sideshow to the profit motive, but must be embedded in the company as a business imperative. One problem that we have is the issue around materiality, because a company will decide what to report on and what not to report on in terms of the materiality of what they exclude or include. Our problem is how this materiality is defined and arrived at. It should not be the prerogative of the company to determine materiality, but materiality must be a product of stakeholder engagement and consultation. So that is Industry All's approach to what good reporting and reporting that is useful is. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Glenn. That was really, really great, a great overview. Crystal, what I wanted to ask is a point that that Glenn just touched upon. So there is actually a disincentive for corporation to report on violations, because that looks bad. So there is an incentive to report on the positives. Do you think that the new act in Norway will help to shift the scene? I know this is again a big question about future things, but just from your perspective here.
Yeah, I just want to second, first of all, what's been said by Hester and Glenn and Kalpona and others in terms of reporting. Really, really strong points. I think one does need a culture change, and the way to start creating that culture change in terms of reporting about risks and challenges and how these are being dealt with calls for requiring that explicitly, as the Norwegian Transparency Act does. It requires reporting on risks. It requires stakeholder engagement. So that's where you start, and then hopefully that will begin to create a culture about more transparency, also about actual adverse impacts and risks of adverse impacts. And I think maybe that's also happening now in the EU, and some of the instruments that are coming there, reporting on principal adverse impacts. So that could also be a part of creating a shift in terms of reporting and reporting about things, about the challenges and how these are being dealt with.
Thank you. Well, I think that's the most important part, to not only have a positive picture. Dimitri, I would like you to be the last panelist to answer my question. So we now heard about transparency from all panels, that's actually an important part, but it's also transparency not only about the facts that you show, but also about the methodology that you have used. So could you talk a bit about this, and also what you think are the most pressing issues that for corporate reports to change?
I think it will be interesting, as was just mentioned, sort of the need for requirements on reporting to shift us away from this, we just report the positive. I'm sure that would help. I'm sure also it will be some of the changes. Good reporting will likely evolve beyond requirements. It's just simply impossible to require really good reporting. But one clear aspect of good reporting is the ability for independent perspective and critical comments, a dialogue that's provoked by the reporting of findings, which causes people to reflect and improve. I think a first of that, and I'm sure I'm not saying anything new, is full transparency in terms of the supplier network, in terms of where suppliers are, who suppliers are. That allows the possibility of independent, unexpected, uncoordinated monitoring, which is more likely to identify gaps in existing systems. And I think every methodology needs that input. I think reporting needs to be defined well enough that there's room for critical analysis. You see some of these reports that are put out that are too loose. It's all this fuzzy positive stuff. One of the things that I think should drive good reporting beyond requirements is people should think more on what credibility is, because frankly, it's just not credible to simply report positive, fluffy good news. That doesn't reflect a robust system of monitoring. We all know the difficulty of the issues. We all know this is hard. We're all lacking resources. Anyone who's telling you that they're not encountering a lot of problems is likely not doing their job very well. And that accountability on methods, I definitely support. Just being able to judge how the results might reflect deficiencies in the methodology is a really important conversation to bring into the light, and allow multiple stakeholders to be able to comment on and contribute to. And there's also, we come back to the opening, or maybe my opening comments about the conflict of interest, and others who have stressed the need for worker voice, that workers need to be involved in this. They need to be very clear in reporting. And I would even go one step further, and this certainly sort of maybe just reflects the union perspective, that worker voice is not enough. Workers can very easily be blind to some issues. They can miss certain key issues when they're not empowered, when they're poor, they're overworked, when they don't have the education, or even just from the fact of being individuals. All individuals have kind of a limited sight over the conditions around them, their environment. We need collective representation. We need groups that are thinking to represent workers. They need to be able to help interpret workers' voice, to comment on that. Obviously, there may be discussions about who is appropriate in that role, but that is really important to good reporting. And part of the worker voice element of that is also about looking for persistence and continuity in reporting. So as we started with naming and shaming, that there are these one-off kind of comments. There may be a high-profile incident that gets a lot of attention, and everybody looks at what's going on now. And then, okay, there's a problem, and it mobilizes a lot of effort to improve. And a year later, oh, look how much we've improved. And then everybody turns somewhere else, and the next year, things move, and not always and often in the wrong direction. We need continuity of monitoring and kind of that persistence to be able to see where are we really having enduring positive effects.
Thank you, Dimitri. It was a great last points you made. Thank you, Kalpona. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Hester. Thank you, Dimitri, Michael, and Glenn, for your time, for your expertise. That was really a very interesting, at least for me, I hope for participants too, session. We will have another session, and let me just briefly share the screen. So we still don't have a clear date on when the next session it will be. We know what we will talk about. It's about enforcing due diligence. So we will go now on the next step in our next session. So if you're interested, please check our website or get our newsletter so you can get an update when this is coming up. Thank you again for all panelists for your insights, and let's hope that the new Norwegian law will give us the boost we all need in our work. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.